Biden administration under the Inflation Reduction Act enacted $79 billion in new funding for the IRS, doubling the agency's budget by 2031 and growing its workforce by tens of thousands. This is funding that will lead, according to the latest GAO reports, to 600,000 more audits on middle-class taxpayers. Chairman Smith, can you walk us through the cuts that this legislation includes to stop the Biden IRS hiring and auditing blitz on the American middle class?
So we've been asking for the IRS to give us a plan of how they wanted to spend the additional $80 billion that they had. One, they finally gave that to Congress about 8 weeks ago. They've broken down how they were spending the $80 billion. $1.4 billion of it was for hiring more agents. And what the bill before you does, it eliminates that $1.4 billion for this year.
So we've eliminated the hiring of new agents for this fiscal year in this agreement.
According to the IRS's plan, that's why there's the $1.4 billion being removed from this bill.
Okay. Thank you, Chairman Smith. In January, the first vote we took as House Republicans was to rescind the billions in taxpayer dollars allotted to the IRS by the Biden administration for the thousands of new agents and hundreds of thousands of new audits. The Biden administration vowed to supercharge the IRS with new money and agents to extend the long arm of enforcement into the pockets of, not the top earners, but everyday taxpayers making less than $75,000 a year. Now, flash forward to today, and we have now included in this deal provisions to stop the Biden administration from funding this IRS expansion. I'd like to pivot here, Chairman Smith, to the subject of work requirements included in the legislation. Under the current law, states must demonstrate at least 50% of the state's work-eligible individuals receiving assistance through the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, or TANF program, are engaged in work or the states face a penalty. Chairman Smith, how have states skirted these requirements and penalties, and how does the Fiscal Responsibility Act restore accountability to this safety net program?
There's several ways that the states have created loopholes in regards to TANF. For example, under that work participation rate, every state's supposed to be at 50%, but they have found, in fact, 34 states last year had 0% participation rate. 57% of all TANF recipients were not part of the work requirement. And so this bill actually closes a loophole. One way that they would change the participation rates is by issuing small checks. This outlines in this bill that checks under $35 are not counted towards the guidelines in order to qualify as fulfilling the guidelines of the work requirements. It also changes the caseload numbers that they looked at in 2005 to at least 2015. Our original bill brought it to, current. So it does a couple great modifications that actually, it's the most substantial reforms to TANF in over 2 decades.
Very good. Thank you. And similarly to the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP, how have state waivers pushed by Democratic administrations allowed for states to skirt SNAP requirements? And what does this legislation do to steer SNAP back towards greater accountability as a hand up rather than a permanent government dependency program?
I'm not near the school of SNAP.
One of the things that states do within the food stamp program is implement a lot of waivers. I mean, right now there are just state after state where every county is covered by a waiver to avoid having to do work requirements. And some of that may have made sense in 2008 and 2009 when the Great Recession hit and unemployment rate was so high and people had difficulty getting jobs. But now with the economy humming the way it is now, unemployment rate down, in low digits, 40-year lows, there's not that problem with people having the opportunity to get jobs And, you know, the American people are very charitable. They want to be able to help people, give them a hand up, but they also expect that there's an obligation and responsibility on the part of the recipients as well.
Great. And thank you. How do you see these reforms to TANF and SNAP helping House Republicans to restore long-term accountability to these programs beyond the legislation that we have in front of us today?
I think one of the things that we look at is, one, how do we help the economy grow? Having more people back in the workforce, helping build their skills back up and getting into a full-time job, ultimately being skilled and having positions where they earn enough that they don't need food stamps or TANF assistance at all. That's obviously a benefit. Actually, it's a double benefit. You don't have the spending to provide that hand up, but you also have tax revenue that comes from the increased and improvements in the economy.
Thank you, Chairman Smith and Congressman Estes. The bottom line is this. This administration cannot be allowed to use the potential of a default as a threat to bully Congress and the American taxpayer into passing a carte blanche, clean debt ceiling that does nothing to shore up the out-of-control spending that goes on at this very point today. Now, House Republicans, we went to the negotiating table, and for 100 days, there was no action from the White House. They were the sole voice in the conversation about our country's fiscal future. And we came back with legislation that we have before us today. As my colleagues have pointed out, it represents the largest reduction to our nation's deficit in history. And this legislation includes $2 trillion in cuts to government spending, a halt to the Biden administration's aggressive expansion of the IRS that could be targeted right at middle-class America, a clawback of $28 billion in unspent COVID funds from the boondoggle legislation that Democrats and President Biden spent the last 2 years enacting into law, causing historic inflation that hurt so many Americans, and a restoration of accountability and work requirements to safety net programs that ensure that they give Americans a hand up, not a permanent government dependency. We have an opportunity today to ensure that any increase in the debt ceiling comes with important provisions and put the brakes on some of this administration's worst policies and saves hardworking taxpayers trillions of dollars in the process. We owe it to our veterans and our children and our grandchildren to get this process started. It's a long process, and our work is not nearly done. We have to get much more done through the appropriations process. This isn't everything that we wanted. Limit, Save, Grow wasn't everything that many people within the Republican conference wanted, but it was a step in the right direction. And in divided government, you know, this legislation before us provides the next practical step forward. So once again, I appreciate all the work that went into hammering out this critical deal, an important first step that we have before us today, and I yield back.
I thank my friend, the gentleman from New York, for his thoughtful